Welcome to Climate Optimists. I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Todd DeShida.
You know, I always start this by saying thank you for tuning in, but I was just realizing the other day that there's probably a lot of young people who don't really even know what tuning in means, because I feel like radios with dials where you actually tuned in the frequency of the station haven't been a thing for a little while. And anyway,
It's just a catchphrase to them. They don't have any frame of reference on what the actual analog nature of tuning anything in is.
I know, it just made me feel old. That's all.
Well, we are old.
I mean, we're not old. We're just not young. We're in the middle somewhere.
It's crazy to think that we're in the middle.
I know. So today we're going to be talking about the built world and the solutions that exist to lower its greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the progress we're making.
Before we get into that, did you hear about the EU considering labeling natural gas as sustainable?
I did. It's kind of like a less offensive version of clean coal,
Yeah,
but
right.
it's just greenwashing. It sounds like Austria and Luxembourg, though, were threatening to sue if it goes through, which is good. So maybe our European listeners and other activists in Europe will push hard and get that thrown out, because while we know we need natural gas as a transition fuel, we don't want to be mislabeling it. It's just less bad. It's not good.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like something we'd do here in the U.S. I'm surprised we haven't tried it.
I mean, the industry's been trying to get it labeled that way for a long
Sure.
time. But yeah, as we know, unless it's renewable natural gas from, like methane capture at a feedlot or landfill, there's nothing sustainable about it.
On to more happy news, for a reason for hope, the UK investment firm Aviva is pressuring company leaders on climate. They plan to vote to remove board members of companies that are taking part in deforestation. And for those of you that don't know, Aviva manages like the equivalent of 356 billion US dollars in assets. So it's a lot. I mean, that's a big chunk.
It's a big firm.
356 billion. We should plug in Trump soundbite there. Billions and billions. He always said that every time. He could never just say a billion. There's a billion of them. It was always billions and billions.
I mean, it does add extra emphasis. It's a little more impressive. Ridiculous at the same time, but
Right. Oh, yeah.
well, that's exciting.
Yeah.
I know Aviva has already been pushing for, companies to make more sustainable choices, but it sounds like they're kind of, ratcheting up the pressure and,
Yeah.
threatening to vote against executive pay deals if the firms are falling short.
Mm-hmm. No, it's really cool.
Yeah, positive. I mean, we need firms like Vanguard and others here in the U.S. to follow their lead. And I mean, if it was me, if we were talking about lack of follow through or taking climate change seriously, I wouldn't be voting to freeze, pay raises on CEOs. I'd be, voting to put them out on a melting glacier. So,
the melting glacier. They'll be sitting there with them and a polar bear sitting there just sliding along out there, and not for very long, probably.
No. Well, it's good to hear, though. I think at the end of the day, if there's one language that business speaks, it's money. And having a huge firm like this turn up the pressure is a good thing.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, before we introduce today's guest, I thought it might be valuable to share some stats to kind of underscore the importance of focusing on reducing emissions in our buildings. So, for context, buildings account for over a third of global emissions. The number of buildings is growing. The equivalent of Paris in floor space is added every 5 days, which is just astounding.
That is crazy.
And the majority of that new construction is set to take place in areas in the world without strong energy codes. Taken together, these three factors show how critical it is to address building emissions if we're going to hit our global climate targets.
Right.
So before today, and doing our research on buildings, how much did you know?
Well, Jason, I don't know if a lot of our listeners know this, but I do work in facilities for the city of Portland. So I consider myself somewhat of an expert in this area. Actually, it prepared me to know little to nothing about this, which is sad. No, I knew some basic concepts of some of this, so I was actually able to follow, the interview that's coming up. How about you?
Yeah, similarly, I knew that, you know, emissions from the built sector were big, and I guess what I didn't appreciate was, some of the progress that's being made, which is obviously a good thing.
Right.
Our guest today is Jeff Rios. Jeff works at building design and engineering firm AKF, where he works as a partner and co-director of their energy and performance team. With a background in engineering, he specializes in increasing energy efficiency within new and existing buildings. He's shared his expertise in many places, including at Greenbuild on well building, at Urban Green on New York City's energy codes, and as a contributing lecturer at Cooper Union. Jeff also serves as a member of the ACEC Metro Region Energy Code Committee, as well as the NYC DOB Energy Code Advisory Committee. It's a lot of acronyms, and if I botched them, Jeff, I apologize.
It's a baller with all those acronyms.
Jeff, welcome to Climate Optimist.
Thanks, Jason. Nice to be here.
So we have a question we ask all of our guests to start things out, and so wanted to ask that of you. When you think about efforts to address climate change, in the situation we're in,
Yeah.
what gives you some hope?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question, and I feel like, quite honestly, in the last couple of years, I have a better answer than I did prior to that. I would say, like, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, my answer is always like, "Oh, I don't know. We're trying to do what we can, but we're not getting super far." I feel like in the last couple of years, I've gotten a little more optimistic. For a long time, it's just been like sort of relative savings and how good can we try to get? And there's the handful of really showcase projects that have done a great job, but the showcase projects aren't getting the world to you know carbon neutral, right? That's not going to
Right.
change, that's not going to solve the climate disaster, right? So I feel like recently there's legislation that's come out in a few jurisdictions in the US that has really tried to put everybody in the same boat in a way that's really meaningful, right? Like focus on carbon and trying to push that number down and try to push carbon impact down.
That's great. So it sounds like in the past there've been these great examples probably of buildings that are, low carbon, but that's
Yeah.
been more the exception than the rule. And now you've got some legislation that's got some teeth behind it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, for a good portion of my career, I would have a couple of really awesome projects that were net zero and all, renewable on site and doing some awesome stuff. But, you know, one net zero building in a city of thousands of buildings, not it's not it's not solving the problem, right?
Right. Right.
But that city passing legislation that limits emissions for every building in the city and starts to phase out the use of natural gas over time, that is going to help, right? So that's kind of where I'm at, and that's what's been encouraging me in the last couple of years.
So I think that's a good segue, for folks who maybe aren't aware of the built world's contribution to carbon emissions. Could you kind of lay that out for us and what are the sources of emissions when we talk about the built world?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So when I talk about emissions and emissions in the built environment, it's a couple of things. Primarily, it's sort of operational carbon, which is at your house, like all the electricity you use, all the gas you burn, all the fuel oil you burn, whatever your sources of energy are. All of those sources have a relative carbon that's emitted as a result, right? It depends on where you live and where you get your power from. For electricity, any fossil fuel you burn is pretty straightforward, right? You burn that, you emit carbon. So that's operational. That's a big piece of it. The other side of it is that's increasingly getting more and more attention is what's called embodied carbon, and that's sort of the carbon that goes into the concrete and steel and wood and chipboard and everything else that makes up our buildings, right? So that those two combined are very significant contribution to the carbon that's emitted in the world. I think globally, the number is on the order of 30 to 40% of total carbon emissions, and one of those two sources. So that's a huge number. Something on the order of 10 to 15% is embodied, and the rest of that is from operational. So it's a big number. And then as you get more and more dense, so like I'm Personally, I live and work in New York City primarily, and in New York City, the number is closer to 70% comes from buildings, and that's due to us having a lot of buildings and not as much transit. So it's a big impact globally, and and depending on where you live, cities are it's even higher contribution.
Yeah, I hadn't, and we were talking about this a little bit before we started the interview, but
Yeah.
the the differences you might have depending on how, rural or densely populated things are. So I think that leads kind of naturally into the next question, which is like, okay, given these sources of emissions you're talking about, what are sort of the menu of solutions that exist for making the world, the built world, less carbon intensive?
Yeah, that's that's obviously the question, right? That's sort of the big that's the big question. And so over the course of my career, think I've had any number of answers to that. And it starts with the very basics of what's your building envelope look like? How much insulation do you have? What kind of windows do you have? What's the heat loss through the skin load? All the way through to what's your mechanical systems, your plumbing system, your how you're heating your hot water. There's efficient ways to do all that stuff. There's a variety of different system types. I think these days, and this is related to my answer earlier, sort of like what's encouraging me or making me hopeful. There's really been increasingly, I think, nationally, a focus on carbon itself and really kind of pushing trying to get fossil fuels out of the industry, right? So really getting towards an efficient electric heating system. The buildings and everybody that has a house knows that most of the stuff you use in your building is electricity, right? Everything, your cooling system is likely electric. Or, you charge your cell phone, you turn on the TV, that's all electricity. But for historically, for most of the U.S., our heating source has been some sort of fossil fuel, and very similar to the conversation that happens around cars and the automobile industry and transit. Pushing towards an electric solution is long term kind of where we need to go if we want to truly be carbon neutral. Now that's going to take a long time, but recently in my world I've been seeing a push towards that, and a push in like a real way. It's no longer like a theoretical conversation. There's buildings we're doing now that are doing all electric heating in northeastern climates where it's cold. It's a complicated solution from a technology standpoint, and really it's changing the way we used to do buildings. But
Sure.
it's simple in terms of like, well, what's the goal? To heat electrically efficiently. That's
Right.
the goal. Okay, we can do that. We don't have to play a lot of games with like relative baselines and savings and trimming energy here and there.
Yeah, that does make it simple when you can kind of put it into those two buckets. So, be more efficient in how you use your energy and go electric.
Absolutely. So I mentioned some of this legislation that's kind of driving this, and in New York City, there's kind of two things that have come out in the last couple of years. The first is just in the building's emissions limit. So every building above 25,000 square feet has to report emissions, and if you exceed a limit that's been set by the city, you get a fine, essentially, right? So that's obviously driving a lot of conversations around: do we get a fine? What's our projection look like? Are we okay? When do we need to do something? That kind of thing. The second legislation that's come out in the last month or 2 months now, is the end of December, is going forward starting in 2024, the beginning of 2024, and for lower rise buildings, and then in 2027 for higher rise buildings. No new buildings can get a gas hookup for heating in New York
Wow.
City. There's exceptions to that, so like healthcare facilities a little bit different, but it's pretty sweeping, right? Now that's going to help the conversation for sure. But what I've seen so far is anytime somebody's doing something already, so like if you're doing a big renovation, you're doing a new building, you're in the act of doing a project. This is a primary discussion point, right? Like, how do we do this? What do we do to address this? Do we do all electric? How do we do it? Let's make it happen, and it's happening. I have yet to see a whole lot of buildings that are just existing buildings embark on a project just to address these laws yet. But I think that's coming in the future, right? As boilers die and need to be replaced, as things, we are going to see it happening in lots of buildings.
Gotcha. So that's helpful. So I think you answered in a way one of my questions, which was like, what's the trigger, right? So if I own a big high rise in New York City, and maybe I'm not, climate conscious, what's gonna
Yeah.
be the stick or the carrot that convinces me to move to electric heat and make my building more efficient? And it sounds like if my building's horribly inefficient, there's going to be penalties that help motivate me. And then at a certain juncture, I'm assuming if I have my natural gas system that uses a boiler and that dies, then that potentially creates a conversation as well.
Yeah, that's what I've been seeing for sure. And this most significant fines are probably not coming for most owners till 2030. That's a specific New York City conversation, but we are seeing people start to plan for that now because it's phased.
Gotcha.
So
So I think having a better understanding, as you've articulated, of kind of like what solutions exist, both getting more efficient and, moving to electric, where should the bar be set? What level of efficiency should we be aiming for in buildings? Is it like a energy usage per square foot? And are there standards out there like, folks may be familiar with LEED or Energy Star that really should be sort of adopted as a minimum?
So that's a great question, and it's a difficult answer. I think it does depend on a number of factors. I think sort of the older ways of thinking about this, and which are lead, Energy Star, and EUI, which EUI is energy use intensity, which is the energy per square foot per year. That those are all really good metrics and benchmarks to set. In addition to that, in much of the country, just standard energy codes, honestly, the minimum energy codes have really advanced quite a bit. The reductions from 2010, which is what many lead buildings are kind of held to, the reduction over that time is staggering in terms of how much the baseline energy code minimum building has come down. So I think increasingly those building standards and energy codes have become more and more stringent in a way that is impacting all the buildings getting built, and they're making them efficient to the point that if we do start transitioning towards a fossil fuel free heating solution, that's a pretty good building, and kind of setting us up on a pathway, I feel, towards a solution that we can have buildings that are really not major carbon emitters.
It's exciting. I mean, exciting to think about that that's at least on the horizon. So I guess maybe as a follow-on, if you're looking at your crystal ball, when can we expect buildings to be kind of net zero? When we think of net zero buildings, become sort of the standard.
Yeah. So first off, it depends on what you mean by net zero, because that's a term that gets used very frequently in the building world. I feel like what it used to mean, or what it used to mean to me anyway, was net zero energy on site, which was a building that had a bunch of renewable resources installed on the building, solar panels on the roof, etc., and could generate as much every year as it used. That's not going to be something that happens with every building in the country, right? We're just not
Right.
going to see that, right? For lots of reasons, right? So increasingly, I'm thinking of net zero as net zero impact. In order to be net zero, it needs to be entirely electric, getting any resource, whether it produces itself on the building or it receives it from the grid, that is renewable or largely renewable, right? But that's the solution to me, right? Like a net zero building in the future is going to be one that can be zero if the grid is clean, because
Right.
that's the only way it's going to be at scale. And that's starting to be something we're designing and building now. When does that happen everywhere? I think between now and 2030, most places in the country are like feeling it out and starting to figure out what it looks like. And if I'm again, this is crystal ball. This is not
I'm not
don't
going to
come
hold you
back
to
if
it.
it, yeah, exactly. But between 2030 and 2040, I think this is really going to be what happens. Like I think this is going to start happening at mass scale, because between the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be figured out, and certain locations are going to make it mandatory. Others are going to start incentivizing it. It's going to start happening. The grid's going to start getting cleaner in most of the country, and then the following 10 years, 2030 to 2040, it's going to really be rolling out at larger scale, I think.
So kind of, fast forwarding then, I'm envisioning a building that is very efficient. It might have some on-site, generation technology. So like, some solar panels on the roof, depending on where it
Hmm.
is.
Yep.
But then ultimately it's not using fossil fuels. It's not using natural gas to heat it. And the electricity that it is using is coming from a grid that, fingers crossed, is 100% carbon free. And so that enables the building to be, in what we're kind of talking about, sort of a net zero emitter.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the sort of pathway to a future net zero for everybody.
So, as a follow on to that, and I'm thinking, you're talking about these changes that are coming. If you could, sort of had the power to sort of make these decisions, what would you say do we need to really kind of accelerate, this conversion from a built infrastructure of where we are to one that's high efficiency and green?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a combination of maybe it's two primary factors, right? It's the codes and the legislation, which has started to happen in certain areas of the country. I've mentioned New York a few times. Boston has similar emissions targets and limits that are rolling out on buildings up there for existing buildings. Really, the existing building legislation is pretty meaningful, right? Because it's you can do all you wanted with new buildings, but by 2040, a lot of the buildings we have today are still going to be around. So if you don't address
Right.
them, you're not going to address the problem in whole. So it's legislation, which is a combination of code, but code generally only impacts the building if you're doing something in the building, right? You live in your house, unless you do anything, nobody's asking you about building codes, right? Unless you want
Right.
to put on addition or do whatever, right? That's the case generally speaking. So it's a combination of building code as well as just legislation that's really going to start tracking and looking at emissions for all the buildings that are out there today. So that's one piece. The second piece is, really to get this stuff to move quicker, incentives are gonna need to play a role, and that's gonna be incentives for building owners, homeowners. Even if you're comparing, if you're doing a building now and you're looking at putting in a boiler versus a all electric heat pump system, heat pump costs more, right? So incentives are going to play a role, I think, especially in these next 5 to 10 years, and we're seeing that there's definitely a real push to it. There's been incentives in much of the country for energy savings for a long time, federal and state driven, and they've been effective. I've seen recently a real push towards carbon being the metric,
Okay.
specifically targeting all electric. In New York, there's very lucrative incentives these days for heat pump solutions. So it's becoming attractive for folks to do it. It's not just because they want to or they need to do something anyway. It's like, hey, we can get a good chunk of change here to convert this, and it's making that conversation a lot easier with owners.
And, anybody who is, a homeowner can probably relate to, incentives, whether local, state, or federal, like you said, where it's like, hey, I get a credit for buying a more efficient appliance or, putting in more efficient windows. Eh, what's the incentive structure look like for commercial buildings? I mean, it sounds like it exists. I mean,
Yeah.
is it something that needs to be ramped up more? I know, like in the Build Back Better bill, or not Build Back Better, I know in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, there's, money set aside for um, residential stuff.
Right.
Is there, a kind of equivalent savings available for if I'm a commercial building owner and I want to
Yep.
be green to make that transition?
Yeah, there definitely is, and it depends on the location you're in. Much of that is state driven, so it depends on which state you're in. The function of it's not terribly different than what you might see as a residential customer. Most of it is driven by utility companies and sort of programs that are paid for by. There's a little line item often in your utility bill, right, that goes to this fund that sort of incentivizes stuff. There's typically different programs for residential and commercial style buildings,
Sure.
but they often are done in parallel. It's infrequent, at least in many of the areas that I work, where you wouldn't have a similar commercial grade incentive that you might have for residential. So all those heat pump incentives, that's something you can get for your house and also for your million square foot office building. They're different programs, but it's the same kind of stuff.
So we've been focusing a lot on, changing codes, and I think a lot around reducing the carbon associated with a building's operations. And I know in the beginning you mentioned, embodied carbon. And so I guess I'm wondering, when it comes to like the steel and the cement, which folks are aware, globally producing steel and cement are big sources of emissions. What role can the building industry play in, helping green those materials, right? Reduce the
Yeah.
carbon content, if you will.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's been an increasing area of focus in my world in the built environment for a while, and particularly in the last few years. To be quite honest, I'm not the expert in that. I mean, this tends to be. This is an interesting question, right? So I'm an engineer, and engineers generally tend to focus on the systems in the building, and those relate very directly to the operational energy, right? They also have embodied carbon in them, but it's harder to track, right? The metal in a boiler or a heat pump and all the stuff that goes into that is harder to track than is concrete, wood, steel that goes into building the structure of a building. So often architects and structural engineers are more focused on embodied than are folks like myself. That said, increasingly embodied has been something that's been looked at across all trades, so including systems engineering as well. I will say there's a few things that have been done over the last 20 years that have helped and continue to help. Things like recycled content in various different building materials, recycled steel, concrete with slag in it. That's not steel. That's still structurally sound. Stuff like that. That's been increasingly important. Recently, one of the changes we've seen in the industry is really the allowance for what's called mass timber. There used to be limits on how high you could build with mass timber, or what the type of structure you could build with mass timber, and those have been sort of changing over the last few years, where you can build taller with mass timber than you used to be able to, and you build a larger commercial building than you might have in the past. Mass timber is typically less of an embodied carbon contributor than would be a steel or concrete building. So that's been changing, and that's been something that I think folks are starting to pay more attention to than they used to.
And when you say mass timber, are we envisioning, classic like rough cut lumber, or are we talking about stuff that is
No, it's
almost
more advanced
laminated
than
and
that. Yeah,
okay.
yeah, it's more advanced than that. It's a very, and again, this is not my area of expertise, but yeah, it's kind of an engineered timber, right? It's made of wood, but it's fire rated, it's structurally rated. It's pretty advanced actually. It's pretty cool stuff. And there's more and more buildings like that happening around the country, but actually probably much more in the Northwest than my area of the world.
Right.
So
Well, no, that's exciting to know. I mean, could be a, more of a disruptor. Well, I could, go on talking with you about buildings for hours and I'm sure put our listeners to sleep, but um, wanted to just thank you for, spending the time to come on and share your expertise and educate us a little bit on the built world and, some of the exciting advancements there. I know, as people are thinking about climate solutions, we look to the structures that we live and work in, and it's good to know that there's progress being made there. So, yeah, thanks for coming on and appreciate you sharing with us.
absolutely, yeah, it was fun.
Thoughts on the interview with Jeff?
I really dug it. I was interested to hear about mass timber, which was a term that I really didn't understand and wasn't super familiar with. But I think everybody's seen it. You'll see it in a lot of construction where you see like the large support beams in a building, like an auditorium or something like that, where it looks
Right.
like just a bunch of single 2x4s that are like laminated together. But that stuff is a really cool product, and as Jeff mentioned, could be a real big help because it is less carbon intensive than concrete and steel, and it sounds like they're beginning to try to find more high rise type applications than it historically has been used for. So
Yeah.
also, heat pump technology seems to improved to kind of cover a wider swath of the northern climates. I thought that was really cool. And you've got heat pumps at your house, don't you?
Yeah, I
At
did. I
your old
converted
house.
over. And for the benefit of folks who aren't, super comfortable with, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning terms, I mean, a heat pump is basically a piece of equipment that runs on electricity, similar to an air conditioner, except it can provide both heat and cooling. And it would replace, as Jeff was saying, what would normally be natural gas furnaces. So
Mm-hmm.
instead of having to have that natural gas furnace and then have standalone air conditioning units, you now have one piece of equipment that serves both functions.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I also liked his point too about zero emission buildings, and I think it is important to note that a lot of those claims are going to be based on whether or not you're going to be able to get green, clean power off the grid. The other, one of the major takeaways I took from what Jeff was talking about was that we really need to push for, really substantial incentives to get building owners to, build with this in mind in new construction, but also, to kind of retrofit older buildings and that's really one of the things I would say I noticed too from being in the facilities business is there's a pretty big disparity between the efficiency of newer construction and some of this older stuff. But, you know, there's good news on the horizon. I mean, the number of countries with building energy codes is increasing. In 2015, there were 62. In 2021, there were 80, and 43 of those have mandatory codes. So we're getting there. Obviously, like everything else we talk about, we have a ways to go, but we're moving forward. So, yeah, it was really cool. What did you think about what Jeff had to say?
I mean, I was glad that I decided not to base all my knowledge on building operations on what I learned from you. Um, no, I thought he did a great job. I was encouraged to hear that not only do we have, countries that are taking the lead on improving their codes, but you have places like New York City and Boston that are making the decision to say, hey, all new construction is going to have to be electric. And when you
Right.
have cities on that scale making those kind of decisions, I think it acts as a forcing function, for others to adopt. So
Right.
I thought that was great.
It blew my mind a little bit when he mentioned New York, and I think what did he say? It was like 75%.
Yeah, I think it was 70% of their, in essence, their carbon emissions in the city are the built
Yeah,
infrastructure.
it makes sense, right? I mean, there's just they have so many huge buildings there, and their transportation system is more efficient. They probably have a lot less cars running around just because it's so impractical. Impractical.
I think it's impractical,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
but I liked impractical. I mean, I thought that was a
yeah.
new.
Impractical. I'm just creating new words on the fly. Um, but yeah, I was really blown away by that. And when you're in that situation, yeah, there's definitely a lot of gains that you can get to by improving buildings.
Yeah, I get the sense that we're on the right trajectory. Things need to, accelerate. And, after the interview, I went out and, did some additional reading and stumbled into the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, which is a UN environment program, and they do like an annual report, and their prognosis is we're not on track to reach Paris, but
Mm,
it's encouraging to see more and more countries adopting energy codes into their building codes.
yeah.
And I guess there's a number of African countries that are in the process of making that transition. A fairly long list that includes like, Cameroon, Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania. So, you know, back to what you were saying, it's like we're not there yet,
Hmm.
clearly, but it seems like the momentum is in the right direction. And, given how long a building stays out there, I mean, yeah, you really want to do it right the first time.
Very true.
One of the things I, read in that global status report that was also interesting was they were talking about where the built infrastructure is set to grow,
Hmm.
and again, this underscores the need for updating codes, but it said 82% of the population growth by 2030 is set to be added in areas with either voluntary or no building energy codes. The other thing that sort of uncovered in that same report, and I think Jeff may have hinted at this a little bit, but that climate change is really only going to magnify our energy use in buildings. Hotter temperatures are going to lead to more air conditioning,
Hmm.
and the International Energy Agency actually projects that between now and 2050, the number of AC units will more than double. So I think right now there's
Wow.
about 2 billion in the world, and it's set to be 5.5 billion by 2050. So
Whoa.
clearly, not only do we need to be improving codes, but we need to be improving, standards for these, pieces of equipment, right? And then I guess my final kind of takeaway was just that, you know, embodied carbon, that really could be transformational for other sectors. I mean, you mentioned mass timber, but I even think about, you know, cement and steel, which are huge sources of emissions, and we know are going to be emissions that are hard to get rid of. And if you see a future where you have, nations, municipalities saying, hey, a certain percent of the materials we get have to be, carbon free or low carbon or whatever that is,
Hmm.
that all of a sudden it creates a market that enables you to fund the technologies you need to to help those industries become carbon free, right?
Hmm.
So I guess in conclusion, I think listening to Jeff, I felt hopeful about, the momentum that's taking place in the building sector, the fact that, these um, cool, net zero buildings are no longer just on the periphery, that you have building codes becoming or requiring, buildings to be more and more efficient, and in turn that driving a built environment that is where we want it to be going in terms of carbon emissions.
Yeah, agreed.
So as always, this always leads to, what can we do as individuals? And I don't think trying to understand building code is going to be um, is going to be super advantageous. And I'm thinking about it with this episode. I'm trying to figure out what could be a value. I think there's sort of two things. The first, and we've talked about this before, but the Build Back Better bill that got stalled, around the holidays, the version that passed out of the House has a lot of great climate provisions, and within that, a lot of incentives related to building. And so, first opportunity, take some time to send a message to your senator, encouraging them to revisit, Build Back Better, trying to find a version that can, that can pass.
Right.
I think the second opportunity is really kind of a personal one, which is if you don't live in a brand new home or a home that's recently, been upgraded to make it more efficient, is to, get a home energy audit. You can generally find resources through your local, energy provider. And a lot of times they're even free, but, you can have somebody come out, they'll take a look at your house and be able to tell you where your biggest opportunities are for improvement in terms of being more efficient.
Sweet.
When it comes to both these opportunities, we'll have more information in the show notes for this episode on our website. And I think that's a wrap for today. Thanks, as always, for tuning in. Come back next week for more climate solutions, reasons for hope, and ways each of us can make a difference. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimists.co. That's climateoptimists.co. And don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimists Podcast.